I like Jujutsu Kaisen. If I had to say what I like about it most, it'd be that the majority of the main and secondary cast are charismatic and genuinely fun to see in action. To go with this, there are actual stakes when they fight, since almost no one is safe, which I really do appreciate in a battle shonen. Furthermore, Gege is not afraid to pause the action and focus on various characters interacting together on occasion. And when he has the time and energy to focus on his art, the manga's dark, detailed, yet always a bit messy, but somehow in a good way, art style really appeals to me. It's really unique when compared to both previous and contemporary Shonen Jump titles. Now, the things I do not particularly like are Gege's handling of Jujutsu as a power system, the incessant addition of new characters which are either complete fodder or whose purpose is narratively forced and seemingly there to prolong the serialization, and, very specifically, the decision to kill off Suguru Geto and instate Kenjaku as one of the two main villains of the series. In this video, I'll be elaborating on that last one. Let's get into it. The reason I do not particularly like Kenjaku is because Gege, intentionally or not, has portrayed Geto as a much more dynamic, interesting and sympathetic villain. His fall was very well portrayed and fleshed out. It's believable in the context of the setting. While I always had this feeling, what made me able to articulate why is Aleczandxr's video titled Suguru Geto's Reason to Kill. I highly recommend you check it out either before or after watching this video. Everything from the dirty, bloody and unappreciated work that being a Jujutsu sorcerer entails, the unfortunate requirement of his ability to consume curses in order to gain dominion over them, the taste of which has in no unclear terms been described as absolutely vile, the fact that non-sorcerers, while unknowingly, nonetheless are directly responsible for the existence of curses, which, as mentioned, Geto must consume in order to fulfill his dirty, bloody and thankless duty, and finally, the isolation brought on by him over time, losing connection to his friends and colleagues due to their difference in power in this line of work, all just work to make his character arc narratively satisfying and compelling. While the audience is not meant to approve of his answer to the quandary that are curses, i.e. the eradication of curses through the genocide of all non-sorcerers, we are meant to sympathize with his plight and see this answer, while morally appalling under most commonly accepted ethical standards, as nonetheless a very arguable, necessary evil. If you remember, the one who had actually started him on this path was Yuki Tsukumo, who initially offered him two solutions to the issue of curses. 1. Eliminate curse energy from mankind, thereby making the manifestation of curses impossible. Or 2. Make it possible for all of humanity to control their cursed energy, thereby making them effectively into Jujutsu sorcerers who, due to their control over it, effectively leak no cursed energy, which is primarily how curses come into being. However, in his jaded and depressed state, Suguru offers a third option. Call all non-sorcerers. Yuki even admits this to be the easiest route, as it would in her mind cause curse energy to evolve as a survival strategy in those non-sorcerers trying to stay alive. She then goes on to make an analogy to birds evolving wings, which makes me doubt Jujutsu High's biology curriculum, but considering they're effectively supernatural child soldiers, let's ignore that for now. The main crux of Geto's worldview is the following. A. Non-sorcerers are the primary source of curses. B. Curses are a cause of great harm and suffering to both non-sorcerers and the sorcerers that protect them. C. This is unjust, but nonetheless unavoidable since D. Non-sorcerers cannot simply become sorcerers, and curse energy cannot simply be cleansed from the world. Therefore, E. Killing off all non-sorcerers is a moral good, which would effectively cease the propagation of curses in its tracks. The fact that while vile and cruel, his reasoning is at least sound is what makes for an excellent and compelling villain. Him deciding to murder his own non-sorcerer parents just to prove himself and everyone else that his new path will leave no room for nepotism is a nice and brutal touch. However, the reasoning I just outlined does not actually fully encompass the scope of Geto's new ideology, which is mired in a hatred and disgust towards all non-sorcerers. See, Geto himself doesn't actually view what he is doing as a necessary evil, which would be more compelling in my opinion, but as a purely moral good, viewing Jujutsu sorcerers as some form of Ubermensch who inherently possess greater moral worth. While I do understand how he got to that point, especially following the roaring applause by the non-sorcerers of the Time Vessel Association, welcoming Rinko Amanai's death, and the inhumane treatment of Nanako and Mimiko Hasaba by the regular people of their village, both of these incidents must nonetheless take into consideration the mitigating circumstance of non-sorcerer ignorance. The members of the Time Vessel Association saw Tengen as a supernatural and divine being, which you can't really blame them for. They worship him in their own way, manipulated by the higher-ups with actual knowledge of Jujutsu. On the other hand, the villagers were still reeling from and in a panic over the supernatural disaster that had befallen them, and predictably blamed the two supernaturally inclined little girls. Both of these incidents, like numerous others I'm sure, see cruelty born out of ignorance. An ignorance decided on and proliferated by the Jujutsu community as a whole. To add to this, the members of the Jujutsu community, i.e. Jujutsu sorcerers, can hardly be called paragons of moral virtue in any sense of the word. While it's very important to remember that they are still people and will consequently encompass the entire spectrum of morality, from the most deplorable to the most virtuous, I'd argue that Jujutsu sorcerers as a whole would actually gravitate towards the degeneracy end of the scale. This is not only because of an inflated sense of their own worth, the belief that they are entirely above the law, and consequent lack of value for the lives of non-sorcerers, but also the rigidity, nepotism, decadence, constant power politics, and scheming characteristic to a good portion of Jujutsu high society. Let's not even mention the subgroup of mercenaries, assassins, serial killers, and so on, the inclinations of which were only suppressed thanks to the existence of Gojo Satoru. This was all to make the point that Jujutsu sorcerers do not have the moral high ground in comparison to regular people. As such, while Geto's decision to call all non-sorcerers can be logically argued as having basis in reality if his goal was to reduce long-term suffering and harm, their perceived lesser moral worth cannot be objectively argued, and the abject hate Geto has towards them is something that can only be viewed as an entirely emotional response to his own personal experience. Though I must admit that I had personally found this hate just a bit narratively forced. While I understand how the story was structured to get him to this point, and this was well done, mind you, I was having trouble parsing why someone like Geto especially, who was so devoted to protecting others, would put all the blame single-handedly on the shoulders of non-sorcerers. And not only that, but would start elevating sorcerers as inherently superior. How I was able to rationalize this is that a good portion of the truly evil Jujutsu practitioners were lying low thanks to Gojo. I'm sure they had to come across quite a few unsavory sorcerers on their missions, but it is possible that they were indeed so sparse and would perhaps even have taken further steps to avoid Geto, in particular due to his association with Gojo. Therefore, whenever he would have encountered them, Geto may have viewed them as an exception and not the rule, thereby continuing to view sorcerers as selfless guardians of the weak, doing their very best to perform their dirty, bloody, and thankless duty. What all this had done is left room for him to potentially either realize the folly of his ways if either A, it turned out that the options offered by Yuki were somehow actually doable, there's precedent in the manga that this would potentially be possible through Tengen, and or B, all of the truly vile sorcerers that were keeping a low profile started taking action following Gojo's sealing. This would then in turn leave room for the following two options for Geto's character arc to take. First, it would have allowed for him to double down on his hate of non-sorcerers and complete his fall to the depths of depravity, by effectively admitting that what was driving him was his hate for them and not actually the eradication of curses. This would be slightly jarring in my opinion, considering the points about his character previously mentioned, but could still make for a compelling conclusion to his character arc if handled correctly. Or two, it would have allowed for Geto to realize the folly of his ways, recognizing that while his end goal, the eradication of curses, may have been a noble one, his methods and hate were both misplaced and condemnable. He was not looking forward to fighting his former friends and fellow sorcerers in the proper timeline, so him either deciding to at least somewhat redeem himself or to indeed take the plunge could have been powerful either way, depending on how either would have been executed, of course. Now, as the series has progressed thus far, without going into any manga spoilers, I find the role of Kenjaku as one of the two big bads along with Sukuna really uninteresting. His goal to merge curses and humans for what effectively comes down to shits and giggles is boring and cliché. While genuinely charismatic and fun to see on screen, he's nonetheless only riding the coattails of Geto, having seemingly adopted a good portion of his personality. Essentially, whenever I see him do something, I find myself thinking how much more weight it would have had were it actually Geto. Everything from the interactions with the special grade curses to him meeting and sealing Gojo. Finally, maybe my biggest gripe is that Kenjaku can't win. As in, even if Gege would like to go with a Kenjaku win, him effectively culling the whole of the Japanese people is not something I see the Shonen Jump editorial staff approving, though I really don't think that's something Gege is looking to do, since I'm not sure how narratively satisfying or even sensical that would be considering the current setup. I imagine the closest he'll get to his goal is merging people and curses on a local level, only for him and the abomination to be stopped before spreading across the whole of Japan. Alternatively, Kenjaku could have even remained as a concept but served a different role. He could have been a special great curse Geto had as a backup in case he ever got killed. In this hypothetical timeline, Kenjaku would have been directly responsible for Geto's revival. They'd be under a pact, wherein Geto would need to find an adequate replacement for Kenjaku to inhabit before both are freed of each other, though I'm imagining Kenjaku wouldn't mind the arrangement quite as much as Geto would. In this scenario, Geto would still be working with the special great curses, as their aligned goal of sealing Gojo would outweigh any animosity they would have had for each other. They'd of course both be viewing this as a temporary alliance and scheming on how to best screw over the other in the background. Geto's goal to end curses, unlike Kenjaku's own goal, as it is canonically in the story, if one of the initial two options as provided by Yuki became feasible, could have actually worked very well narratively. The very last battle of the series could potentially have been an internal conflict among the sorcerers themselves, some wanting to keep the status quo with most of the big bad special grades now gone at this hypothetical point in the timeline, while others would recognize this as only a temporary solution and would aim to either A. rid everyone of curse energy, thereby ridding Jujutsu sorcery from the world and upending Jujutsu sorcerers as an institution, or B. turning the whole world's populace into sorcerers, which many would see as overly dangerous and effectively as substituting the danger posed by curses for that posed by malevolent Jujutsu practitioners. While curses were for the most part relegated to Japan thanks to Tengen, this would see Jujutsu sorcery becoming a ubiquitous worldwide phenomena, which would entail a far larger potential danger from bad actors to the populace at large. Both sides would have a point, and there'd be no clear good side in the conflict. The end would be bittersweet, no matter who won or lost, which in my mind would complement the tone of the series rather well. But I'm going to stop here. I never intended for this video to turn into those what-if alternate timeline fanfics. My point was to simply illustrate how Geto staying alive could potentially have altered the story in a way I personally find more compelling. Even if you don't agree personally, I hope I've at least made a good enough case wherein you can see where I'm coming from. It's worth mentioning that during the sealing of Gojo, we saw that Geto hasn't been completely overwritten and is still conscious and responsive on some minor level. While he could still make some kind of comeback, maybe following Kenjaku's plans in the last dramatic moments of a climactic final battle, thereby redeeming himself, unless handled masterfully and the setup for it is not currently there, as far as I can see, I wouldn't be satisfied with that turn of events at this point. It would amount to an overused shonen cliché, which I definitely would not like to see in an otherwise solid work such as Jujutsu Kaisen. And that's about that. To be honest, I'm not too involved in the online discourse surrounding Jujutsu Kaisen, so I'm really not sure whether or not the notion I just put forward is at all a novel one. It's probably not, but I do hope my perspective at least brings something new to the table. I'd really appreciate any and all feedback. It was a really captivating notion to think about, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on the matter as well. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.